Well, look, I mean, this is what those of us who were never Trumpers warned against when Donald Trump began to make headway in the Republican Party, which was that not only was he going to destroy the country, he was going to destroy the party too. And Bannon's kind of campaign of permanent revolution against presumably fellow travelers, people who agree with him on at least many issues, is more evidence of that. You know, before the election, Bannon had told a historian that he considered himself a Leninist. And of course, Bannon denied the comment, but that's exactly the way he's been playing it ever since, which is first you gain complete control over your party, and then you sort of have a constant revolution. This is what they're going to do. They're gonna try to drive out any of the classical liberalism that used to inform at least parts of the Republican Party, the parts that I sympathized with, and turn the Republicans into a party of nativists and bigots.
So we saw the president and Senator Bob Corker. They were certainly going at it on Twitter. And Bannon, in fact, referenced it yesterday at the Values Voter Summit. I want to take a listen to that.
Bob Corker has trashed the commander-in-chief of our armed forces while we have young men and women in harm's way, right? Well, he said he's leading them on a path to World War III, that he is not stable, that people have to keep him moderated, that it's an adult... It's an adult center, and they took the morning shift off?
Yeah, but let's remember who started this. Why does he not talk about the president trashing Corker first?
Well, first of all, there is that, and it ignores the fact that Bob Corker, unlike some other Republicans, began trying to work with the president. Tried, like I think many people who thought, well, he got elected, he deserves the benefit of the doubt. Tried to cooperate with the president. You know, what Bob Corker did, I think, is the epitome of patriotism. He is sounding an alarm bell as loudly as he can that the commander-in-chief is unfit to hold the office that he does. And people who are genuinely patriotic ought to commend him. It's particularly funny, by the way, coming from Bannon, who himself used to leak against the president when he was in the White House. It's another example of the hypocrisy of the guy, although I don't know why anyone should be surprised by that. Before
I get further to Bannon's rhetoric, how widespread do you believe that ideology you just talked about, people's opinions of the president, how widespread is that within the Republican Party?
I think it's almost universal. That is to say, at least among friends I speak to, even those who support him in some sense understand that this is a man who in a different world would have no business being president. Anyone who has spent any amount of time with Donald Trump does not come away from a meeting with the impression that this is a guy who is in command of his facts, who is able to carry on sort of logical, sequential thinking, who is anything more than just overmastered by his impulses and his temper. So it's very difficult to imagine that anyone who is acquainted with the president doesn't feel this way. The real question is who's being honest among the Republicans and forthright, and who is simply going along with what they know is a charade.
So was Bob Corker being honest and forthright when he said that McMaster, Mattis, and Kelly were the three men that were keeping this country from descending into chaos?
Does anyone doubt that?
Okay, how about Senator Susan Collins? She said today that she thinks Americans are tired of Bannon's rhetoric. Let's listen to what she had to say.
Mr. Bannon's over-the-top rhetoric is not helpful. Mitch McConnell is the Senate Majority Leader. The president needs him. I'm glad that they're working together on tax reform and a lot of other issues, and I'm glad that they're meeting this week. Mr. Bannon's comments are not helpful in that regard.
Brett, do you think the president still listens to Bannon? Does he still have the president's ear?
I think there's no question. I mean, there are widespread reports that Bannon basically has an open line to the White House. And we know that the way that Trump operates is that even when you're fired, you're never really fired. You're always somewhere within the orbit. You're always just a phone call away. You know, I think people like Senator Collins are, I mean, they're great public servants. But the Republican Party that still wants to keep its sanity, and by the way, still wants to represent a good consensus of the American people, needs to stand up much more forcefully than they have so far to the Bannonite wing, because what Bannon stands for is the antithesis of a Republican Party that can hope to win national elections and remain a majority party in the future. Otherwise, we are moving to the collapse of the party. And for those of us who care about genuinely conservative ideas, an invitation to Democrats into the future to become the permanent majority party of the United States as Republicans tear themselves to pieces.
Look, isn't the job of the White House Chief of Staff to be the gatekeeper, the person who knows who goes in and out and run everything in that regard? And if so, why can't John Kelly do something to decrease the amount of communication between Steve Bannon and the president?
Well, unfortunately, because he's the president, Alex. I mean, you know, I've joked earlier that they're engaged in a form of extreme babysitting, but at least with babysitters, the presumption is the babysitter is the adult or the near adult, and the baby is a baby. No one is going to be able to prevent the president from resorting to Twitter. Nobody is going to be able to prevent the president from picking up the phone. So the most that we can hope from them, and I think what they're doing is courageous. I certainly wouldn't want to be in their shoes, is for them to contain the damage. They're never going to be able to tamp it so long as Trump is president.